Greetings! It is I, Tantus Naravan Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It is time to return to our discussions on the Forgotten CCGs of old. We started to talk about Vampire the Eternal Struggle last time. I talked about its history. Today we're going to begin to dive into the rules of the game, so you know how to play Vampire the Eternal Struggle. Let's just start with the basics. You're taking the role of Methuselah, an ancient vampire that's basically using younger vampires, gaining influence over them in order to defeat your rival Methuselahs. The point of the game is to score victory points. You gain influence with these younger vampires and use your influence that you have, represented by a pool of counters, in order to weed away and destroy the influence of another rival vampire that you have. You'll effectively use this influence you have to cause them to do various actions that are going to affect your opponent's influence. So it is a matter of the fact that the very thing you're protecting, you have to use in order to defeat your enemies. A little tricky there. Now, should you ever run out of influence in your pool, you're ousted from the game, or effectively you're out of the game. At the end of the game, victory points are tallied, and regardless of where people are at that point in time, person with the highest victory points wins. I will put a link to the current rules in the description below, but I'm just going to go over everything basically now over the next couple of episodes. If you want to check it out and have a copy for yourself, go ahead. Now let's talk about some concepts that are going to be important to know about. First off, tapping and untapping. When I talk about tapping, it's something that's actually very common in a lot of CCGs. I'm effectively taking one of my straight up cards that I can read, turning it on its side. This is to represent that this card has used some kind of ability that it is affecting in the game. It has either activated ability or I've used an ability that causes it to tap. I've used it up. Now, I can then untap it to represent it's refreshed and I have the ability to possibly use this card again. This is like for minions especially. I could untap that minion and be like, oh, this minion is once again active. I could use this tapping ability it had before, or I could use it for something else entirely. Your minion needs to be untapped to block the actions of other minions or to react to any circumstance. So effectively, I have to return it to its original position, untap it, to get it in this circumstance where I could use it in a more defensive material. If it's tapped, I can't. I've just chosen it to use it in some other manner. Now, if a card of yours becomes burned, especially a minion, it goes to your discard pile, or as it's called, ash heap. Once in its ash heap, it is effectively burned out of the game, sort of. A burned counter, blood point, is put into the blood bank. Now, at any time, I can check my discard / ash heap and look at any of the cards within it. It is important to note there are some cards which will remove a card from the game. This is different than going to the ash heap. This is going to a separate area. The reason why we have to specify this difference is there are cards which might allow me to then also go into my ash heap, choose a card for it, and return it from there. This does not affect cards that are been removed from the game. This only affects cards which have gone to the ash heap. If a card is burned or removed from the game, then anything that is attached to it or any blood points attached to it, blood counters, are then also burned. So I have a minion, it gets burned, cards attached to it, get burned, counters attached to it, get burned. Now, the first thing you're going to need to play the game is, of course, cards. And these cards are representative of two decks. First off is your Crypt deck, which you have to have a minimum of 12 cards in. These are the young vampire minions you have, or other types of minions that you might be able to use in the course of the game. The second type of deck is, of course, your library. Your library is going to be at least 40 cards. Your library will have a maximum. The maximum is going to depend on the number of players you have. For each player that is taking place in the game, the maximum size of your library goes up by 10. So if I'm playing a 6-player game, my maximum size of my library would be 60. Minimum is still 40. That's the minimum I want, regardless of any kind of situation. It's just there is an upper limit on it. Your Crypt, on the other hand, has no upper limit. It is important to note about the crypt, though, that they have to be from the same group or consecutive groups. I will talk about what this means later on, but for those of you that are familiar with Vampire the Masquerade, the game that's based on, effectively you have to choose a side of Camarilla or Sabbat. Those are the simple way of saying it. It is a little more complex than that. We'll go into that. Now, there is no maximum number of the same copy of a card that you can have in any deck. So technically speaking, I could have my entire crypt or my entire library be all the same cards. It's not actually helpful, but I could. I could have any number of a card in one of these decks. It just, you should have a variety of cards for a variety of situations. You do not bog yourself down. Now, you're going to need some tokens now that you have your cards. These are your blood counters. You're going to need at least 40. You're going to need 30 to represent your basic starting pool of blood that you're going to have, and you should have 2 that you can allow to help with the blood bank that will be established, the place that all the burned counters will go to. You can use a wide variety of things that represent this. Glass beads, pennies are usually best. Things like dice are not recommended. Not that you couldn't use them, but these counters move around very fluidly. So having something physical that one represents one for the counters is a lot more helpful than, let's say, moving numbers on a die around and trying to remember how you're doing them exactly. So you see why it's discouraged to use dice. Last, you're going to need some kind of edge symbol. What this represents is that you're gaining an edge in the battle. What happens when one of your minions basically gives you edge, an advantage over one of your opponents? Then the player that got the advantage gets this edge counter, and it does represent some kind of bonuses that they get throughout the turn. So effectively you want to earn this edge. It's a token used to represent that. Now the last thing I do want to talk about today is ownership of cards. No matter what happens in the course of the game, at the end of the game, when everything is said and done, ownership of cards should not change. Nothing should change that. Every card that you started with, when everything is done with the game, should return to you. And this does not mean that your cards leave the game as soon as you are ousted. If another player has control of something that you had originally, that you own, and you've been ousted, it stays in the game until it is burned. So you actually have to wait until the end of the game and then return the rest, get back the rest of the cards which left your deck. But you should get those cards back. You shouldn't have the transfer of ownership of cards. Again, just because you leave the game doesn't mean they leave the game. They stay until they would be burned, hit the ash heap, then you can remove them from the game. So that's it for today. I introduced you to some basics about, of course, Vampire the Eternal Struggle. I talked about the concept of the game, earning victory points, ousting your opponents by removing all of their influence, and maintaining your influence too. Talked about some basic concepts with the tapped card and the untapped card. Talked about burning something, basically sending it to your discard or ash heap, and I talked about removing it from the game. I then moved into talking about what you need to play the game. Your 2 decks of cards, your counters, and of course your edge token that you're going to need. I then finished up by talking about ownership of cards. In the next episode, we are going to dive into the types of cards. We're going to talk about what kind of stuff is on a crypt card, what kind of stuff is on a library card, and move on from there. Because once you understand all the symbols and information on these cards, it really does help you gain a big step in the process of playing this game. So if you have any questions, comments, anything you want to say, anything you think I left out, please leave in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe. It shows your support the channel, the Empire, the work I do. If you want to show some extra support, you can always check out my Patreon, a link description below. But regardless, until the next time, I bid you farewell.